There's a quiet assumption people make in today's world. If someone isn't visible, they must be insecure. If they're not posting their face, their life, their achievements, something must be missing. But what if the opposite is true? What if the people who show the least are actually the ones who need validation the least? And what if empaths, the ones who understand people the most, are the very ones choosing not to be seen? And if this video makes sense to you, don't forget to like it, because it helps push this message to people who actually need to hear it. We live in a culture where being seen is often mistaken for being valuable. The more attention you receive, the more important you appear. The more reactions you get, the more real your life begins to feel, not just to others, but even to yourself. Over time, this creates a subtle but powerful illusion. It convinces people that visibility is proof of worth, that if something isn't being noticed, it somehow matters less. But this system has a hidden flaw. It slowly trains people to outsource their identity. Instead of developing a stable sense of self from within, people begin measuring themselves through external feedback. Instead of asking, "Who am I?" when no one is watching, they start asking, "How am I being perceived right now?" And that shift is not small, it's psychological. Because the moment your focus moves outward like that, you stop living from your internal experience and start adjusting yourself for external approval. You begin filtering your personality, curating your behavior, editing your life into something more acceptable, more likable, more visible. And without realizing it, you move away from authenticity and closer to performance. That's the trade most people don't even realize they're making, but empaths tend to notice it. They sense how quickly attention can become addictive, how easily identity can become dependent on reaction. And once they see that pattern clearly, they don't rush toward it. They hesitate. Not because they lack confidence, but because they understand the cost of tying your self-worth to being seen. Empaths don't just see content, they feel intention. Where most people scroll past a photo, a caption, or a video without thinking too deeply about it, an empath often picks up on what's underneath. Because for them, it's never just about what is being shown, it's about why it's being shown. Where others see a simple post, an empath may sense the emotional need behind it. The quiet desire to be noticed, the unspoken request for validation, the subtle comparison woven into presentation, the performance that hides inside what appears to be authenticity. And this awareness isn't something they turn on and off. It's automatic. They read tone. They notice energy. They feel emotional signals most people overlook. And once you start seeing social media through that lens, it stops feeling light and casual. It starts feeling layered. Every post begins to carry meaning. Every interaction starts to feel like an exchange. Not necessarily fake, but emotionally loaded. Because underneath the surface, there's often a transaction happening, attention for approval, visibility for reassurance, expression for reaction. And empaths feel that dynamic in real time. For someone who already processes emotions deeply, this constant exposure becomes overwhelming. It's not just scrolling anymore, it's absorbing intentions, absorbing energy, absorbing emotional signals from dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. And over time, that builds up, not as obvious stress, but as quiet exhaustion, the kind that doesn't come from doing too much, but from feeling too much too often without pause. Here's what most people don't realize. For an empath, visibility isn't neutral. It's not just posting or being seen in a simple, harmless way. Because the moment you become visible, you also become interpretable. And being interpreted is never clean. It's filtered through other people's minds, their insecurities, their experiences, their assumptions, their mood. which means every time something is shared, it doesn't stay pure. It enters multiple psychological spaces at once. It becomes part of someone's comparison, someone's jealousy, someone's silent judgment, someone's projection, someone's misunderstanding. And most people don't think about this. They post and move on. But empaths don't experience it that way. They feel the weight of those unseen reactions, not individually, but collectively. It's like an invisible pressure, not loud enough to notice instantly, but strong enough to drain you over time. And this is where people get it wrong. They assume empaths avoid visibility because they're insecure. But it's not about weakness, it's about awareness. Empaths understand something others overlook, that attention is not always light, and being seen is not always safe emotionally. So instead of asking, why don't they post more, a better question is, how much are they consciously choosing not to absorb? Because sometimes not showing yourself isn't about hiding. It's about protecting your mental and emotional space from becoming overcrowded with other people's perceptions. Most people build an image, not necessarily fake, but carefully shaped, adjusted, curated, designed to be seen in a certain way. Empaths, on the other hand, tend to move differently. They are less interested in building an image and more focused on protecting a reality. A reality that feels consistent inside them, even when no one is watching. That's the real difference. Because the moment your identity starts depending on reactions, likes, comments, approval, attention, validation, you slowly begin losing control over it. Your sense of self stops being anchored internally and starts shifting externally. And when that happens, something subtle but powerful breaks. Your confidence is no longer stable. It rises when people respond positively and drops when they don't. Your peace is no longer fixed. It becomes negotiable, dependent on how the world is reacting to you on a given day. And your self-worth slowly turns into something public, something measured, something observed, something influenced by people who don't even know you deeply. That's a fragile way to exist, even if it doesn't feel like it at first. Empaths often sense this risk early, not always through logic, but through emotional awareness. They can feel how quickly identity becomes unstable when it is constantly exposed to external feedback. So instead of leaning into that system, they step slightly away from it. Not completely disconnected, not emotionally absent, just less dependent. They choose something most people don't notice as a choice at all. They choose to exist without constant feedback loops, without needing every moment validated, without needing every expression approved, without turning identity into something that must be continuously confirmed by others. And in that space, something important begins to form. A quieter sense of self, a more grounded identity, one that doesn't shift every time attention shifts. And that is where real psychological stability starts to appear. As empaths grow, something quiet but significant begins to shift inside them. It doesn't usually happen suddenly. It happens through experience, reflection, and emotional learning over time. And because of that, they don't become distant from people. They become selective with access. There's a difference. Distant means disconnected. Selective means intentional. They start realizing something most people rarely pause to consider. Not everything meaningful needs exposure. Some moments lose their depth when they are turned into content. Some emotions lose their purity when they are turned into performance. Some experiences become less real when they are constantly observed instead of lived. And slowly, a deeper understanding forms. Not everything real needs an audience. Some things are complete in themselves. They don't need validation, documentation, or external confirmation to matter. And perhaps the most important realization of all, not everything sacred survives being seen too often, because the more something is exposed to outside interpretation, the more it becomes shaped by opinions, assumptions, and projections. And empaths feel that shift very clearly. So instead of overexposing their lives, they begin to pull back. Not from people, not from connection, not from relationships, but from unnecessary access. They start deciding what belongs in the private space of experience, and what, if anything, belongs in the public space of perception. This isn't isolation, it's refinement, a way of filtering what deserves attention from others, and what deserves to remain untouched, unedited, and fully experienced. And over time, this becomes a form of emotional intelligence, because they begin to understand that privacy is not emptiness, it is protection. Protection of peace, protection of meaning, protection of experiences that lose something the moment they are turned into performance. So when empaths become more private as they grow, it's not because they are pulling away from life. It's because they are choosing to keep certain parts of life intact. Privacy is often misunderstood in today's world, because in a culture built on visibility, anything less than constant exposure is quickly judged. People tend to label it in simple terms: insecurity, avoidance, hiding, emotional withdrawal. But those labels usually miss the deeper psychology behind it. For empaths especially, privacy is not about running away from the world. It's about taking control of their relationship with it, because they understand something most people overlook. The moment you become visible, you are no longer just seen, you are interpreted. And interpretation is never neutral. People don't just see you as you are, they see you through their own lens, their experiences, their assumptions, their emotions, their comparisons, their projections. And that means part of you stops belonging only to you. This is where privacy becomes important, not as a defense mechanism, but as a conscious decision. It becomes the ability to decide three crucial things: who gets to see you, how they get to perceive you, and how much of your inner world they are allowed to access and interpret. That level of control changes everything, because instead of being constantly open to interpretation from everyone, you start choosing where your energy, identity, and presence are placed. And that's not fear, it's awareness. It's not avoidance, it's discernment. It's not hiding, it's psychological maturity. Empaths often arrive at this understanding through experience. They realize that unlimited access doesn't create deeper connection, it often creates distortion. So they begin to value selective visibility, not because they want to disappear, but because they want to remain intact. And in that choice, privacy stops being something defensive. It becomes something intelligent. A quiet decision to protect the parts of yourself that lose clarity when exposed too often to the world's interpretations. There's something most people rarely stop to think about. Not everyone who observes you is doing it with good intent. In a world where visibility is constant, observation becomes automatic. But intention behind that observation varies deeply. Some people don't watch you to understand you, they watch to compare themselves with you. Others are not observing to connect, they are observing to compete quietly. And some are not even interested in your story at all. They are looking for cracks, weaknesses, inconsistencies, subtle things they can use, judge, or mentally store. And this is the part most people ignore until experience teaches it to them directly. Empaths, however, tend to feel this layer more intensely, not because they are paranoid, but because they are perceptive. They pick up on emotional undercurrents that others often overlook, and over time, through real experiences, not theories, they begin to learn a difficult truth about visibility, especially after moments like betrayal, after being deeply misunderstood, after trusting the wrong people emotionally, after realizing that openness doesn't always return in the same form it was given. Something inside them changes. They stop treating visibility as something casual. What once felt natural, sharing, expressing, being open, starts to feel more deliberate, more calculated, more aware. And slowly, visibility stops feeling like expression and starts feeling like exposure. Because exposure means more than just being seen. It means being available to interpretation, without control over how that interpretation unfolds. And once an empath understands that difference, their behavior shifts. They don't disappear, they don't isolate, but they become far more conscious of what they reveal, when they reveal it, and to whom. Because they understand that not all attention is safe attention, and not all visibility leads to connection. Sometimes it leads to distortion, and that realization changes how they move through the world. Here's the deeper shift that most people don't consciously notice. Empaths tend to prefer something simple but powerful. They choose experiencing life over displaying it. While much of modern behavior is shaped around being seen, recorded, and validated through external feedback, empaths often operate from a completely different internal priority. Because in most situations, the question people ask has slowly changed over time. Instead of being fully present in a moment, many people now unconsciously think, how will this look? How will it appear on social media? How will others perceive it? How will it be interpreted once it's shared? But empaths naturally lean toward a different question entirely. How does this feel? And that small shift in focus changes everything about how they experience life. Because feeling requires full presence, and presence demands undivided attention. The moment you start documenting life for external consumption, something subtle begins to happen. You are still physically there, but mentally, a part of you steps outside the moment. A part of you starts observing instead of fully living. You begin framing the experience instead of fully dissolving into it. And empaths are often sensitive to this internal split. They can feel when attention is divided between experience and performance. When life is no longer just being lived, but also being managed for perception. So instead of staying in that divided state, they choose presence. Full, unfiltered, undistracted presence. And presence is something social media cannot truly reward. Because presence is not about how something appears after it is shared. It is about how deeply it is experienced while it is happening. And for empaths, that depth matters more than visibility ever could. Most empaths were not always private. In fact, many of them started on the opposite side of the spectrum. They used to share more freely, trust more easily, express themselves without hesitation, and show parts of their inner world without thinking too much about consequences. Because at that stage, openness feels natural. It feels like connection. It feels like honesty. It feels like emotional safety. But life has a way of reshaping that perception over time, through experiences that are not always loud, but deeply impactful. Moments of misunderstanding, situations where sincerity was misread, times when vulnerability was not handled with care, or when trust was given to people who did not value it in the same way. And slowly, a realization begins to form. Not everyone deserves access. Not everyone can hold what you share with the same intention you gave it. And that realization changes everything internally. Because once an empath truly understands this lesson, their personality doesn't harden, it refines. They don't become cold or disconnected, they become precise. Their openness is no longer automatic, it becomes intentional. Their trust is no longer immediate, it becomes earned. And their emotional availability is no longer unlimited, it becomes directed where it is respected. They stop giving themselves freely in spaces where their presence is overlooked or undervalued. Not out of resentment, but out of understanding. Because they begin to recognize that energy, attention, and emotional depth are not things to be distributed without awareness. They are resources that shape identity, peace, and emotional stability. And once that awareness settles in, their behavior naturally shifts. They choose where they invest themselves more carefully. They choose who receives access more consciously. They choose how much of themselves is shared more intelligently. And this is where discernment is born, not from distance, but from experience, from pain that has been understood rather than repeated. And in that shift, the empath doesn't lose openness. They simply learn how to protect it.